Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Season 2 of Canada Files. I'm Jim Deeks, and I thank you for joining us. Our guest on this edition is David Frum, a staff writer at The Atlantic and a frequent commentator on politics and public affairs on MSNBC and other network news programs. What most people don't know is that David was born in Toronto in 1960 and maintains dual Canadian and American citizenship. David has built a respected reputation as a conservative thinker, columnist, and author of 10 books, including Trumpocracy in 2018 and Trumpocalypse in 2020, both strongly critical of Donald Trump and his presidency. We've recorded this interview a few days after Trump's departure from the White House. David Frum, welcome. We will get into the presidency and the legacy of Donald Trump in a few moments, but one of the purposes of Canada Files is to examine the lives of prominent Canadians, amongst whom, even with your focus on American politics, you certainly qualify. So tell us at the outset, how did conservative thinking and right-wing politics become your passion?
Well, I grew up in the 1970s, a time of inflation, a time of seeming social disarray, a time when the predominantly liberal and social democratic ideas of the post-war period seemed to be not working anymore. And so a lot of young people of my cohort went looking for new kinds of ideas to say, how do we restore a working economy, a working society? So I was one of those who joined that turn toward the ideas of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and was influenced very much by what was in the air in my time.
You grew up in a very comfortable Toronto home. Your father was a very successful property developer, and your mother, as most Canadians will remember, was probably the most famous and most respected broadcast journalist in the country a generation ago. But knowing Barbara Frum, as I did a bit, I would have said that she was one of the most scrupulously unbiased journalists, and I would think a political centrist. I'm wondering if either of your parents tried to influence your outlook on politics and public affairs when you were younger.
Oh, my parents had enormous influence over my outlook, and I think really a definitional one. But you have to. I'll speak for a moment in a moment about my father. But the thing to understand about my mother, the experience of talking to Barbara Frum, was disorienting in that you could never predict in advance how she would approach things. I mean, she had the finest, purest reasoning mind.
You know, Barbara and Murray did have different views, or at least, especially when I was younger. In 1980, we had, I think, quite different views. I think I had some influence on them over time, but they certainly have influence on me. And to this day, you know, I hold them up as checks on my thinking. And I do ask myself all the time, what would they have believed about this or that question? But with my dad, I can be more sure what he would say. With Barbara, you can never know.
Well, with that family dynamic, you graduated from high school in Toronto, and then you went to Yale and studied history, and then went on to get a law degree from Harvard, no less. But right out of the gate, though, you came back to Canada and got into journalism. And I'm thinking, with a Harvard law degree as your pedigree, you could have written your own ticket in the law profession in Canada. But was journalism always your intention? Did you never want to be a lawyer?
Look, I can tell a purposeful story about how this went, or I can tell the truthful story that there was just a lot of floundering in my 20s, like a lot of people. And I'm often asked by younger journalists, how do you get into journalism? And I say, you can't just start in journalism. You have to fail at a lot of other things first. And so I spent most of that period reading a lot, traveling a little, making a lot of mistakes, not sure what to do, and sort of stumbling around. So I got into journalism very much by accident. Writing was something that came naturally to me, and it also, the challenge of writing better was interesting to me, and so I spent a lot of time on that, but I would be not accurate to the record if I tried to present any great plan or that I made very conscious decisions to choose one path rather than another.
Well, you obviously chose journalism, and for the next few years you stayed in Canada and worked for a magazine very much like The Atlantic is today, and wrote also for U.S. publications. And then in 2000, from what I understand, you were rather surprised to get an offer to go and work at the White House at the beginning of the George W. Bush administration. Was getting into the inner workings of politics and government an intention, or was it just by accident?
Again, it was a fluky thing. I had covered the Bush campaign in 1999-2000. I'd gotten to know some of the people involved in the campaign, and I liked them. We developed some friendships, but it never occurred to me that this would be any kind of role for me. I think the main reason it happened, and again, this is to emphasize the element of luck, was because of the Bush v. Gore recount. The Bush people could not be certain they were going to form a government until I think about the 2nd or 3rd of December, a month after the election. And so the government had to be constituted very, very hastily, and especially the White House staff. So living in Washington and being available was a major recommendation to anybody. So I got this approach, could you come do it? And I was unsure. I'd never worked in government before. I wasn't sure. To tell you the truth, and I had preferred John McCain in the Republican primaries over George W. Bush in 2000. But curiosity, I was moved by curiosity, by personal friendship, and a sense of, well, this was a responsibility, and you don't say no to those kinds of responsibilities. So I started work in the Bush administration about 4 or 5 days after inauguration in 2001.
And what were your functions in that job?
Well, George W. Bush was, he was not, as all the world knows, he was not a naturally articulate person. And a lot of politicians in that situation would react by dismissing the importance of clear speaking, but he actually upvalued what it was that he wasn't good at. So he built a comparatively small speechwriting team. Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, I think, had 8 or 9 speechwriters. So George W. Bush really had 4, and treated us well, and then we all had sort of responsibilities. And so there was I think the main reason I was hired was because I'd had a background in a lot of economic journalism, so I was there to deal with mostly the domestic agenda, the tax plan, the economic plan. The United States was caught up and was heading into a recession because of the dot-com bust. I worked on agriculture, trade, transportation, all of those kinds of issues, and wrote a lot about there were a lot of trade issues on in the inbox in those days before 9/11. But that was probably the thing I worked on most. But I remember spending a lot of time developing an expertise in agriculture issues.
You were later credited, of course, with coining the phrase axis of evil in relation to the regimes at that time in Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. And this was a time, I think we'll all remember, when America and the president in particular were quite fixated on wanting to eliminate Saddam Hussein as the president of Iraq. Looking back on that now, was that fixation and that paranoia about those countries in the Middle East justified?
I completely shared that at the time. I mean, the premise of it was 9/11 was one of the worst failures in the history of American government. The information was all there to be known. And the ability to stop the attack was all there. It was all distributed. The US government collectively had all the information it needed to protect America. But the connections were not made. So the CIA didn't share with the FBI didn't share with the CIA. Warnings were not taken seriously enough, partly because some of the people making the warnings were left over from the Clinton administration, and there's always a kind of prejudice in a new administration against paying attention. And it was just, so it was a tragedy, it was a horror, but it was also an embarrassment. And afterwards, there was a strong feeling that the United States and the Bush administration must never be embarrassed in this way again. And so, having been too lax, it was not going to repeat that mistake. Next time, it was going to be ultra vigilant. And so, we made the opposite mistake. So whereas we had not been ready enough and active enough in assessing the al-Qaeda threat, we as an administration became then too forward-leaning, too ready to believe the worst. So every piece of information about Iraqi actions and capabilities was given the most alarmist interpretation rather than the least. And I absolutely 100% shared that. So we all thought, we had all this evidence about what they were up to. I mean, they were up to no good in all kinds of ways. Up to no good against their own people, up to no good against their neighborhood. But, you know, you got famously, you got the information, they're importing aluminum tubes. Now, those aluminum tubes could have been used for conventional rockets, which would be annoying but not a world threat, or they could be used in a nuclear program. Which did you choose to believe? We chose to believe the most alarmist. And I think embarrassment over the failure of 9/11, I mean, it's a classic story of government, you know, that government is all about locking the barn door after the horse is gone, and that's what we were doing.
As President Bush's second term was coming to an end, you had left the White House by then, but at that point, you announced that you were going to work with the campaign team of Rudy Giuliani, who was seeking the Republican nomination for president in 2008. I'm not going to ask you about that experience, but I will ask you, what's your view of Giuliani today?
I had lived in New York in the 90s and worked for a New York think tank, and I'd had a good exposure to Rudy Giuliani back when he was mayor. It became apparent to me pretty fast in 2007, 2008, that the man who was running for president was not the same man who had been mayor of New York. And obviously, the change has been even more extreme in the years since 2007, 2008. And I think it's a good thing for everybody that that campaign didn't go any further than it did.
Well, talking about Giuliani gives us a segue into asking the question, as I'm sure most Canadians would want me to ask, but what on earth happened in America to America in 2016?
Look, this is a huge question. I've written so much about it, and the full answer's in the books, but let me just give you a quick. The first thing to bear in mind is in 2016, Donald Trump got 46.1% of the vote, which is a little bit better than John McCain in 2008, but otherwise worse than every single person who was nominated by either party in the 21st century. Worse than Romney, worse than Kerry, worse than Gore, worse than most of the people who lost. So there was a large element of fluke as to how he actually won the presidency. But look, it's shameful enough that he got the nomination. I think that has to do with a lot of the failures of traditional Republican politics. You know, that Republican voters felt the Great Recession the same as anybody else. They felt the slow recovery from the Great Recession. They felt the things I've been talking about since 2005, the same as everybody else. And so, you know, to put it bluntly, I mean, Republican voters were telling their party elites, what we want is more health care, less immigration, and no more Bushes. And going into 2016, the party said, right, what you want is less health care, more immigration, and Jeb Bush. And Republican primary voters said, nuts to that, no we don't. And then Donald Trump, you know, to give him credit, I mean, he's obviously, he's a monster, but to give him credit, in 2015 and 2016, he was talking about things. He didn't offer constructive solutions, but he was talking about the opioid epidemic that was killing so many tens of thousands of people at a time when the other candidates were dismissing it. He undertook that there'd be no reductions in Social Security or Medicare if he were president. All the other candidates said they would shrink it. He promised more health care coverage. Everybody else was talking about repeal of the Affordable Care Act. I mean, his promise was a lie, so I'm going to get rid of Obamacare and replace it with something terrific, and I won't tell you what's in it. But he was promising something better. He talked about immigration and how the United States needed to slow it. He talked about things that mattered. And when he first appeared, I thought, well, maybe he could even be a positive force. Maybe what will happen, and this is now we're talking about the summer of 2015, maybe what will happen is he will show that this conventional republicanism isn't working anymore. He will beat one of the front runners, maybe Jeb Bush, in the early primaries. And at that point, the party will get the message that it needs to integrate the themes this demagogue is talking about. Because demagogues talk about things that people care about. That's how they get to be demagogues. They will find some way to domesticate this agenda into something responsible. And somebody, Marco Rubio, Scott Walker, somebody like that, Rick Perry maybe, who's governor of Texas, somebody will take his themes and create a responsible approach. And that never happened. Donald Trump declared in, I think, June of 2015. By July of 2015, he's the front runner, and he stays the front runner, except for 1 week in November of 2015, all the way until he gets the nomination.
Did his conduct in office, once he got in, even with that low percentage of plurality of vote, did his conduct in office surprise you?
I think it surprises. Like every day, you would say, "Well, it can't be worse than this," and then he would find some way to make it even worse. I think for me, the main surprise was, look, I knew he had no respect for democracy. I knew he was hostile to American global leadership. I knew that the Russians had an unhealthy grip of some kind upon him. And I knew that he was a crook and that he would use the presidency to make money. I think I underestimated the degree to which he was psychologically damaged. In fact, even by his own crook ambitions, he could have been a more successful crook if he had been had a little bit more self-control. And that self-control in office, it degenerated. And until we got to the end where he incited this violent attack on the Congress of the United States.
We're recording this interview a few days after the inauguration of Joe Biden, but a few days before the Senate will vote on whether or not to convict Donald Trump on his second impeachment. I'm not going to ask you what you think the outcome should be or what the outcome will be, but I will ask you what you think the outcome should be, and I assume your opinion will hold even after we know what the outcome is.
So this time around, President Trump incited, and you all saw it on video, and there's no question about the facts, incited a mob to attack the Capitol so as to interrupt the vote so that he could illegally hold on to power. So that's about as bad a thing as a president can do. And I think, the president waged war on the government. He incited a mob of people, and we can see him dancing in the tent before the incitement begins. We can see the crowd responding to him. We can hear what he's saying to them, which is, you have to go stop Mike. He has this fantasy that Mike Pence can somehow interrupt the counting process. And the target, it wasn't just the Congress, it was his own vice president. If this is not the kind of behavior that the founders had in mind, what do we think this process is for?
As I mentioned off the top, the title of your most recent book is Trumpocalypse: Restoring American Democracy. When you were watching the riot unfolding on the Capitol on January the 6th, were you not thinking, oh my God, this is the Trumpocalypse unfolding right before our eyes?
Yeah, no, it was horrifying. Having lived through 9/11, I would say what happened on January 6th was not as instantly terrifying and horrifying as that, because there are so many elements of farsicality to it, and also even that people did die, but it obviously wasn't going to work. It was like 9/11 really did bring down buildings, really did smash up the Pentagon. And was aimed at the Capitol and could have had a decapitation strike against the U.S. government. If the Donald Trump plan had succeeded, Joe Biden would still be sworn in on January 20th. It was a stupid plan. It could have done a lot of damage. And they could have executed people on live stream TV. They could have put a gun to Mike Pence's head and made him recite the magic formula that they foolishly imagined would change the outcome, but it wouldn't. Joe Biden would still be president. The vote had been certified. Inauguration would happen on January the 20th. But that same sense of wrongness and shame and anger The symbolic attacks, this is the thing terrorists understand. There's a big difference between a fire that burns down a building and a terrorist attack that brings down a building. We grieve accidents, but we fear these kinds of political attacks, and that's what Donald Trump incited. And maybe he didn't anticipate every aspect of it, but he really did want Mike Pence to be coerced into breaking the law and changing the outcome of an election that had been over for weeks.
Will you be writing another book on Trump, on his legacy at some point?
I desperately hope not. Although Clay Aiken from American Idol, he interviewed me on his podcast, and he said, you have to write a third book. And I said, I don't want to write a third book about Trump. I've had enough. He said, no, but I've got your title for you. I said, really? What is it? He said, Trump-carceration.
It's pretty good.
But pretty good. But my next book is going to be a history book. It's going to take a longer view, and it's going to go into some of the deeper themes of American life over the time that I've been alive. And I really am hoping that having got through these shocking events and this deeply troubling 4 years, that American politics is going to find its footing again. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to happen automatically. Both at home, the mistrust sown at home and the damage to America's leadership in the world, those are not going to be instantly overcome. But it is something that with goodwill and hard work, there's a lot of progress that can be made, and I hope it will be made.
Let me ask a question from the Canadian perspective about Trump. He obviously was not a great friend of Canada. He didn't make many friends here during his 4 years. From your vantage point, did he affect U.S.-Canada relations irrevocably?
Well, irrevocable is a big word over a long time. And in the end, because Canada and the United States must get along, they will get along. What he did was he did introduce a question mark over future behavior. And he did something else that will have, I think, long-term consequences, maybe not irrevocable, but long-term, which is Canadians and Americans are interested not just in their bilateral relationship with each other, but with their relationship to the external world. I mean, Canada needs from the United States not only open trade between Canada and the United States, it needs the United States to open trade with the rest of the world. So Donald Trump damaged America's relationship with so much of the world and did so much havoc to the world trading system. That's the part that is going, even if the bilateral piece is healed relatively easily. I mean, the two countries are so intimate, they will, the relationships are deep and the friendships are deep and the relationship will be rebuilt. But they are embedded in global networks that are more fragile and where one other thing has to be said, where the American position is changing. And here's a point that just needs to be driven home. When I went to work for George W. Bush, the US economy was about 8 times the size of the Chinese economy. And when Barack Obama became president, the US economy was about 3 times the size of the Chinese economy. The two economies are now near peers. China's maybe a little smaller, but catching up fast. And probably by 2030, China will be bigger if it's not already bigger. So the United States, we know none of us live anymore on a world in which the United States can give orders to the planet in the way that it could in the year 2000 or even 2008. And Donald Trump never understood that, and he fought it by just trying to bark and yell and smash relationships. And that is threatening not just to America, but to everyone who depends on America, beginning with Canada.
David, you've spent about a third of your life now living in the United States. You became a naturalized American citizen about 13 years ago, but you are Canadian. You and your wife are Canadian. You maintain a residence, a country home just east of Toronto. So I want to ask you, assuming you still feel very much Canadian, what does the phrase being Canadian mean to you, and has it helped you or hindered you at all in your career?
There's a part of me that looks from the outside, and that's a bad thing for anybody who wants to be in government, but it's a good thing for a writer. And I think, so many of us in my generation, we grew up watching SCTV, and the whole joke of SCTV was that you were in Toronto watching a badly transmitted TV from Buffalo. And I think that's the reason why so many comedians come from Canada, there's something, just that experience of watching that TV from across the lake and having that slightly distant point of view I think it's just a tremendous spur. I've written my books mostly in Canada. There's this place we go to in Prince Edward County. My wife and I, we've been going there for now 30 years. Our children all spent their summers there. And that's where I do my most creative work. And so I see when I sit down to think and meditate and be out of the turmoil and write for a longer perspective, I'm doing it from across the lake to the Great Republic.
Well, David, from across the lake today, I want to thank you so much for your perspective. Your answers were great, and thanks for being a Canadian and covering the American scene as well as you do.
Thank you so much.
And thank you very much for joining us on Canada Files. We'll see you again next time.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of the North Pine Foundation, as well as the following donors: the Browning Watt Foundation, Nona MacDonald Heaslip, Joe and Marie Heffernan, Michael and Mary Ellen Hogan, Donna and Richard Ivey, Alice and Ted Kernahan, Richard and Gail McGraw, the Bruce H. Mitchell Foundation, Eleanor and Francis Shen, the 63 Foundation, John and Margaret Deeks, Wendy Deeks, in memory of Peter A. Deeks, and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association.